Domestic politics in Russia seems to be the story of one group who does not like another group, pitted against a third group that does not like the first two, all in the shadow of the general public, who may or may not like any of them. But on today's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline, we dive deep into what is happening with the oligarch class in particular, and whether the military is currently usurping them. Over the past several videos on topics regarding the fall of Putin and the end of the war, and the importance that you place on the oligarch class therein, a possibility has arisen in my mind which I would appreciate your analysis on. Is it possible that Russia is moving, and if so, intentionally by Putin, from being an oligarchic dictatorship to a military dictatorship, with the war weakening the power of the oligarchs and boosting the military? Specifically, is Putin incentivized to continue the war to weaken the oligarchs, redistribute wealth, and build a new power base in the military? If so, how does the succession problem play into this? To be honest, I have been avoiding this topic because it is a strategic mess, and I do not have a good answer. So let me give you a whole bunch of individually coherent thoughts that will collectively turn into an incoherent mess. Maybe that will at least help you think about the problem in a more structured way, and then you can draw your own conclusions. Let me start by getting us all on the same footing via a discussion of how the Kremlin is funding the war. This is a common topic that I discuss, so I will be fast. Ever since the Kremlin switched to contracting soldiers through market wages, the war has been a massive cash transfer from the rich to the poor. That is what happens when you skyrocket demand for labor, both by putting soldiers on the front lines and by needing a massive support staff to produce military hardware. Now, the specific individuals getting soaked are the folks who previously hired labor for whatever business they owned. So any oligarch who actually runs an operation, rather than just being trust fund rich, is hit here. I should also note that this is killing small business owners, but no one really talks about them in Russia, despite their American counterparts being an obsession of every US presidential candidate in my lifetime. Meanwhile, generally rich people are getting hit for a couple of reasons. One, all of that government spending has to come from somewhere, and the answer no longer is the Fortress Russia accounts. No matter how they got their money, the rich are currently being hit, and likely will be hit well into the future with higher taxes, because it is easiest to raise money from them. More subtly, they have been cut off from Western trade partners. So business owners, usually the bigger ones, capable of navigating international bureaucracy, are losing out on sales. They are also at least mildly inconvenienced whenever they try to purchase Western luxury goods. So, looking back at the first part of the question, I would not describe this strategy as intentional from the Kremlin. Or at least I would be more precise and say that Putin sees this as a means to an end. He cares about capturing the Donbass. He cares about having a historical legacy that rivals Joseph Stalin or Peter the Great. The rest is a question of what tools he has at his disposal to accomplish those goals. And closer to what the back half of the question was hinting at, Putin needs to take some domestic precautions to stop the oligarchs from going after him. That transitions us to our second individually coherent thought of the day, which is why the oligarchs go along with the plan at all. Well, actually, I'm going to focus on a common explanation for what is happening and why it is wrong. Indeed, here is the most common explanation that you will hear for why oligarchs follow Putin. You might notice that it is basically an identical argument for why ordinary people do not protest, which we also discussed recently. Allegedly, the political contract that the oligarchs entered into is a trade where they offer their support to Putin, and Putin in turn allows them to bend a bunch of rules to make a ton of money. If they cross Putin, then they can be easily replaced, and so they will put up with a lot of nonsense. Now, at one point, it might have been the case that the oligarchs held more sway, but that was a different time. When Putin looked like this, he was barely a political entity. Some sort of oligarchical control still existed, and Putin had not consolidated power. We do not live in that world anymore. So it seems reasonable on the surface that Putin can soak the oligarchs without much concern. There is just one problem with that argument. Putin had consolidated power well before he announced the special military operation. And the man does not run a charity. If oligarchs did not have much choice but to follow Putin, the primary consequence of that will not be them actually following Putin. It will be Putin setting the level of extraction very high, precisely because they have little ability to seek an alternative. That is basically bargaining 101. Negotiated outcomes match what the parties could get if negotiations break down. Whether the parties actually reach that deal or not, though, is a function of bargaining frictions. Consequently, we run into a puzzle. Back in 2021, Putin should have been soaking the oligarchs, pricing them so that they were just willing to continue supporting him. This would imply any further hits to the oligarchy ought to have left that class trying their luck to replace Putin. Well, the war indeed has shifted the flow of benefits away from the oligarchs. Yet, despite the apparent mismatch between bargaining power and bargaining outcomes, the oligarchs remain quiet. We are therefore left to wonder why. In turn, the rest of this video will explore some possible answers to that puzzle, bearing in mind that I do not have a particularly good sense of which is correct. One possibility is that this entire premise is misguided. Maybe something hard to understand is happening behind the scenes. For example, we tend to treat the war as a Vladimir Putin vanity project. But if enough oligarchs also derive active enjoyment out of expanding Russia's borders, they are no longer getting soaked. They are paying to purchase some good, as if this were any other business transaction, except one of the commodities traded is blood. A more strategically interesting answer points back to the original question. If Russia is turning into a military dictatorship headed by a politician, say shades of Saddam Hussein, then oligarchs are following because they have no choice. In other words, the flow of goods is still matching the balance of power, and the balance of power has shifted away from the oligarchs. Pre-war, the oligarchs were in a bad spot. Now they are in an even worse spot, as Putin somehow found a way to have an even greater grip over them. Failure to follow the Kremlin no longer gets you stripped of status. It gets you thrown out of a window. That's the rule. That's the goal now. Obviously, for this to work, you need a compliant military. The benefit to them is that they are now flush with resources. The downside to those with a bias for geopolitical strategy is that all of those resources are being thrown away in Ukraine, leaving open questions about whether Russia will one day turn into nothing more than China's lackey. Meanwhile, for Putin, the decades of institutionalized democracy allows him to get away with this despite the traditional guardianship dilemma. A guardianship dilemma arises when politicians empower the military for international coercive purposes, but military leadership can then turn around and use that power to overthrow the political leadership. For all that hope that the West has that Putin is done, and he is always 3 hours away from Russian citizens marching on the Kremlin, it remains unclear how unpopular he is personally becoming versus the war becoming unpopular. The military, therefore, is discouraged from attempting to remove Putin, lest they become the subject of those street demonstrations. This may also help us understand why the oligarchs are reluctant to make a move on their own. Even if they could remove Putin, they might still be stuck with angry citizens who have benefited from the war revolting against whomever tries to replace it. To circle back to where we started, and to try to offer just the tiniest bit of closure for today, Russia is a soupy mess of factions, and it is unclear who likes whom and to what degree, and that makes it tough for us as keyboard warriors. Like I said, I do not know if any of these are good answers, and in my defense, this is just called the Geopolitics Helpline. I never promised that the help would be any good. Meanwhile, you can torture yourself with the complete and growing collection of helpline questions by clicking here. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.